Every year, a great migration sweeps across the face of Europe. As spring slowly advances northwards, millions of birds follow in its wake. Among them is the majestic European crane. For thousands of years, cranes have been migrating from southern Europe to the far north, an astonishing journey of 2,500 miles. Once they flew over a land covered with thick forests. Today, the scene has changed dramatically. The crane is a delicate species. It suffered for years from changes to its environment. Now its whole future hangs in the balance. For as long as anyone can remember, the call of the crane has been a sign of the changing seasons. Today it rings out with a more urgent message, alerting us to irreversible changes affecting Europe. In southern Sweden, the first flocks of cranes arrive at the beginning of April. They have travelled about 2,000 miles, and their final destination is now only a few hundred miles to the north. Their arrival causes great excitement. For the Swedes, the crane is the harbinger of spring. Every year, tens of thousands of people turn out to welcome them. The ground is still frozen when the cranes return. The first wave, some 15,000 birds, makes landfall in the fields near Lake Hornborga, where the birds know they'll find food. At night, they roost in the lake. 5 attempts have been made to drain it for agricultural land. Finally, the Swedish government raised £6 million to safeguard its future as a wildlife refuge. A large colony of black-headed gulls has recently become established alongside the tourist centre. Until mid-April, more cranes arrive each day. As they approach Hornborga, they come whiffling out of the sky, celebrating the end of their long journey. Cranes were originally attracted to this area by potatoes, grown for a local schnapps distillery. In 1971, the distillery closed down. Within 7 years, the number of visiting cranes dropped from nearly 6,000 to just under 2,000. By popular demand, the local council started putting out barley and planting potatoes to bring the cranes back. They're intelligent birds, and they soon learned to exploit this new source of food. Now 15,000 of them, 3/4 of all Scandinavian cranes, use Hornborga as a stopover. At 5 feet high, the crane is Europe's tallest bird. It dwarfs all the other migrants attracted by the corn. the melting snow collects in small pools where the cranes take the opportunity to bathe. All migratory birds need to keep their feathers in prime condition, and the cranes still have some way to travel. The breeding season is once more upon them, and they're in high spirits. They begin their spectacular courtship rituals here in southern Sweden. European cranes remain faithful to their mates for life. The dancing is highly infectious. Excitement spreads through the flocks as old bonds are strengthened and new partnerships formed. Courtship usually ends with loud trumpeting. Established pairs will duet together for several minutes. As the excitement dies down, the birds begin preening the loose wing feathers which form their bustle. The ritual seems to have a calming effect. The cranes wait for a break in the weather. A prolonged cold spell further north at their nesting grounds can delay the breeding season, and this year the thaw is late. At last, winter's long silence is broken. A pair of ospreys circle the lake. Like cranes, ospreys are migratory. This pair spent the winter in West Africa. Now they've returned to repair their old eyrie. The cranes too return to last year's nesting area, where they immediately re-establish their territory, building a rough nest of grass and reeds. Deep within the Swedish forests, among quaking bogs and quagmires, they are safe from foxes and human disturbance. The cranes complete their nest in a few hours, but the ospreys often take several weeks to repair their eyrie. Although the birds are sociable while they're migrating, they now become intolerant of other cranes. Holding a large territory enables each pair to provide enough food for the family during the breeding season. The task of incubating their 2 eggs is shared by both partners. They change over every 3 or 4 hours. With long legs, ideal for wading, cranes are well equipped for a wetland life. They don't have webbed feet, but they're good swimmers. At this time of year, in these subarctic regions, the temperature can fluctuate wildly, and experienced birds change over as quickly as possible. Leaving the eggs exposed for more than a few minutes can be fatal to the developing chick. For the cranes, there now follows a month of sitting and waiting. Central Sweden has a healthy population of cranes, over 12,500 of them, and in a good year, most suitable territories are occupied. Even so, the nests are usually several miles apart. Throughout the incubation period, the birds keep a constant watch for predators, such as crows and mink, which might steal their eggs. After 30 days, the first egg hatches. Cranes lay their eggs 48 hours apart, so the second chick should hatch 2 days after the first. For its first 2 days of life, a crane chick stays close to the nest. During this period, it forms a strong bond with its parents, which will be very important when the time comes for them to journey south. It has taken a whole day to recover from the exhausting process of hatching, and its parents are now eager to feed it. For the first 3 weeks, young cranes are unable to feed themselves. They depend on their parents to bring them a basic diet of dragonfly larvae and water spiders. All over the marsh, insects are emerging. The young cranes hatch to coincide with this season of plenty. The Swedish summer is short, so the chicks must grow fast. They consume vast quantities of insects at this early stage, but later they'll take snails, frogs, and even small mammals and birds. The second egg has failed to hatch. It's probably infertile because of the late thaw, but the female is reluctant to desert it. Only about 1 in 4 breeding pairs successfully raises 2 chicks. If the second egg does hatch, the pair splits up, each adult taking sole charge of 1 chick, but remaining in vocal contact with its partner. This strategy reduces the chances of both chicks being discovered by predators. Gradually, the cranes lead their chick further and further away from the nest. Moving deeper into the reed beds and forests at the edge of the lake, they become extremely secretive and elusive. In mid-August, the land in the north bears fruit. The crane chicks have turned to a more vegetarian diet, and the cranberry, or craneberry plant, named after them, provides a rich feast before the onset of winter. In 10 short weeks, the crane chick must reach 30 times its hatching weight to survive. 1 month from now, the cold north winds will drive the bird south again. In mid-September, with the winter approaching fast, the cranes leave the marshes and forests and head for the farmlands in the south, where they know from past experience that they'll find food. Their first destination is the island of Öland, off the southeast coast of Sweden. The island is flat and fertile. Cranes from all over Sweden are attracted by the barley left in the fields after the harvest. The young crane is recognizable by its grey-brown head. A hazardous journey of 2,500 miles lies before it. 1 in 3 of this year's young will not survive to return to Sweden. As the sun warms up the ground and the air above it, the land shimmers in a heat haze. The conditions are perfect for migration, and the cranes seem to know it. By midday, thermals of warm air are spiralling upwards. Where they meet the cold upper air stream, water vapour within them condenses to form clouds. The cranes recognise the signs. They use the rising air to save energy, gaining lift without flapping their wings. Once they're high enough, they form into a broad V shape. Then, gliding wherever possible from one thermal to another, they turn to the south. They follow the coastline beneath them until they reach the tip of Öland. Then they head out to sea. As they fly, they join flocks from other parts of Scandinavia. Together, they cross the Baltic Sea to the island of Rügen in North Germany. Over 32,000 cranes from Scandinavia, Russia and Poland gather on Rügen every autumn. About 7,000 of them will fly to the Middle East and on to Africa, while the remainder head for Western Germany. The river Elbe once flooded its banks every winter, creating ideal wetlands for the large numbers of migratory birds. Breeding cranes were once common here, but today a dike contains the floodwaters, and as a result both marshes and birds have gone. Local ornithologists have tried to rectify the situation by ensuring that the earth to finish the dike was dug from specially selected sites. The resulting pits, now a series of lakes and ponds, can be used by the cranes. Conservation efforts throughout Germany are proving successful. At least 1,300 pairs of cranes now breed there. Elsewhere in Europe, wetlands have been drained and converted into featureless prairie farmlands. One by one, marshes where cranes might rest and feed have gone. Once this was one of them. Now it's Hamburg. Fortunately, cranes can fly hundreds of miles without stopping. With the following wind, they can reach speeds of 60 miles an hour. Today, when the cranes leave Germany, the majority fly non-stop to France. Many stop off at a man-made lake 50 miles east of Paris. The rest fly on to Les Landes, an area just south of Bordeaux where there is one last safe refuge. Once a wild place, Les Landes has now been tamed. It was Napoleon's idea to reclaim the heathland for forestry. Latterly, the marshes, which are havens for migratory birds, have been drained for agriculture. The cranes have travelled 2,000 miles, and they need to rest and refuel. Corn left in the fields draws the hungry birds, but food is not the only attraction. Inside a high-security army camp, one last area of marsh provides a vital refuge for the cranes. Protected by the perimeter fence, the birds can roost there, free from human disturbance. Surprisingly, military activity has little adverse effect on the wildlife. But even this last sanctuary is not secure. The camp and the fields round it, where the cranes feed, should have been declared a special protected area under an EC directive. But so far, no declaration has been made. The camp may seem an unlikely refuge for such shy birds, but the cranes have learned to ignore the bombs. Leyland lies directly on one of Europe's major migration routes. Millions of birds pass through here every autumn, and they attract hunters. Outside the camp, the cranes are continually disturbed. It's now illegal to shoot cranes, but the hunters shoot hundreds of thousands of pigeons. Many of the older cranes will have been fired at in the past. Some of them may be 30 years old, and they have long memories. As winter advances across the face of Europe, cold weather again pushes the birds southwards. Ahead lie the Pyrenees, the great mountain range that separates France from Spain. This is the most formidable natural obstacle the cranes must overcome. Some of the peaks are over 10,000 feet high. The cranes must cross the mountains if they're to reach their winter quarters. They need clear weather and a strong tailwind to see them safely over. But as they face their next hurdle, clouds envelop the peaks and the weather closes in. Shrouded by freezing fog, the Pyrenees present an impassable barrier to migrating birds. With visibility down to a few feet, the cranes would quickly become disorientated. They have no choice but to wait north of the mountains until the weather improves. In autumn, almost every crest and pass in the Pyrenees is auctioned off to hunters, and migrating birds are gunned down in their thousands. Now, in November, the massacre is over and the mountains are silent again. As soon as the weather clears, wave after wave of birds flies through the pass. These bramblings, like the cranes, breed in Scandinavia. They follow almost exactly the same route south. They travel fast and as near to the ground as possible to avoid the strong winds. On the western side of the range, there is now one pass through which the birds can migrate safely. In 1979, French ornithologists decided to rent the shooting rights for the col of Orgambidesca to allow at least a few birds safe passage. Where hunters once waited in ambush, now hundreds of observers from all over Europe come to watch and count the birds. Towards the tail end of the migration come the cranes. Unlike the bramblings, the cranes fly high. Riding on the front of an anticyclone, they use the strong winds to speed their flight over the mountains. Each year, French ornithologists study the millions of migrants, in particular the cranes and birds of prey. Against fierce opposition from local hunters, they're still trying to persuade the French government to make Ougambideska into an official reserve for migratory birds. The cranes fly fast. There is no food for them in these high passes, but the red kites which follow in their wake can afford to linger. Hunting for rodents and carrion, these beautiful birds of prey drift slowly over the mountains. Eventually, the kites too make the final push through the mountains and into Spain. On the Spanish side of the Pyrenees lies a desolate plateau. Almost all of the wetlands in this region have recently been drained. Today, all that remains is one brackish lake. In the last 20 years, it has become a crucial refuge for cranes. It's called Laguna Gayocanta. It's a cyclical lake. Every 12 or 15 years, it dries down until there's very little surface water left. During such a dry spell, the lake bed is almost devoid of life. All that will grow are a few salt-tolerant plants. The only fresh water lies in a few drainage ditches at the edge of the lake. They're partially frozen, but they attract migrant birds from miles around. About 60,000 cranes come to Spain each winter. That's almost the whole of the world population. Most of them stop off at Laguna Gayocanta. There's nowhere else for them to go. The young bird is almost fully grown, but the bond with its parents is still strong. Throughout the long journey south, the adults guide and protect their young, even defending them from the more aggressive members of the flock. Because of the water shortage, the birds have to queue for a drink. Cranes need a lot of liquid. During dry periods, the shortage of water at Gayokanta can be a problem. "60 years ago, when there were more wetlands in Spain, the cranes were more widely dispersed across the country. Their arrival was welcomed by the peasant farmers who shot them for food. Now cranes are protected in Spain and they concentrate around Gayokanta. The local farmers are very concerned. 100 cranes trampling over their fields are acceptable, but many thousand are not. The government pays some compensation for the damage, but the farmers say that it is too little and paid too late." As the cranes continue their journey, they fly over the ruins of ancient civilizations. To these early Mediterranean cultures, they were the messengers of the gods. According to Greek legend, the gods gave the warrior Palamedes the gift to interpret the signs of nature. Symbols traced across the sky by skeins of birds inspired him to invent the first letters of the alphabet. At the same time, the cranes were a source of inspiration to people of the north. These Swedish rock engravings from 3,000 years ago depict cranes as symbols of fertility. Because their arrival coincided with the coming of spring, they became the bringers of light. Today they still herald the changing seasons. The day they arrive in Spain is regarded as the first day of winter. Leaving Gayokanta behind them, the cranes fly southwest. Several hundred fly over the Straits of Gibraltar to northern Africa, and a few thousand winter in Portugal. But the vast majority of the 60,000 birds settle in an area in western Spain called Extremadura. After a journey of 2,500 miles and 1 month after they left Rügen, the cranes finally arrive at their winter quarters in Spain. The land was once dominated by dense forests of evergreen oaks. Today, only fragments of the forests remain, but the large sweet acorns still attract the cranes. After a month of traveling in large flocks, they split up into smaller groups and families to spend the winter under the oaks. The cranes stab at the acorns, piercing the tough outer skin to expose the sweet kernel. Until the young birds have learnt the trick, the adults husk the acorns for them. During the winter, cranes with young become highly territorial, claiming a few trees as their own and defending them from intruders. The arrival of a second group in the territory of an established family immediately sparks off a show of aggression. The intruders are no match for the resident family. Eventually, they take to the skies to join a flock circling overhead. The rural economy of this area once centred round the oaks. Their acorns provided nutritious winter fodder for pigs. 40 years ago, the pig business took a dive when African swine fever swept through the country. Now that Spanish pork can once more be exported, business is beginning to recover. More visitors from the north. A flock of white wagtails snap up insects from the ground disturbed by the rooting pigs. Like the cranes, they too are drawn to Extremadura by the warm winters and the abundant supply of food. During the years that the pig market was depressed, there was no demand for acorns, and the value of the trees fell almost overnight. There was no point in protecting them. It's illegal actually to fell an oak tree, but the farmers have traditionally been allowed to harvest the smaller branches for firewood and to make charcoal for export. Cereals took over from pigs, and many of the oak trees were cleared away to make it easier for the tractors to till the fields. Between 1950 and 1985, 8 million oaks were felled in Extremadura. Without the stabilizing effect of the trees, wind and rain began to erode the land. There are now plans to irrigate parts of the area to prevent further destruction. Planting new oak trees to feed the new pigs would be the next step in protecting the soil. At present, the cranes are forced to forage in the newly sown cereal fields, where they run the risk of being poisoned. The seed they feed on is dressed with mercury and other heavy metals. DDT has been banned, but even modern pesticides are bound to take a toll of the birds. By mid-February, the young crane begins to molt into the more distinctive colours of the adults. It'll be 2 years before it develops the full breeding plumage of its parents. With the passing of winter, the corn sends out new shoots. Spring is coming. The cranes can sense it, and the flocks become restless. The time for their northward migration is drawing near, and they must adapt to being one of a crowd again. By the end of February, the days grow longer as the sun rises higher in the sky. The cranes know that it is time to leave. They are ready to return to their breeding grounds in the north. For the last time, their wild cries ring out across the Spanish fields as they retrace the route which brought them south. The northward migration is always much faster than the journey south. Once again, the cranes stop off at Gallo Canto. As they approach the Pyrenees, the sun is setting over the mountains, but the weather is clear and nothing can hold them back. Flying by the light of the moon, with the stars to guide them, the cranes pour over the mountains and push on towards the north. As spring advances across Europe, the land is released from the grip of winter and the way is open for migratory birds. Northern France is still locked in ice and snow. Despite the bitter weather, the cranes head for Lac de Der-Chantecoq, 50 miles east of Paris. This lake was established only 30 years ago, but it has become crucial for cranes. The speed with which they have adopted it reflects their need for another stopping place. The cranes feed in the maize stubbles to the west of the lake. The Champagne district has always been important to them, but before the creation of the lake, the birds were scattered throughout the region. During the last 20 years, their numbers have risen at Lac de Der, until now more than 23,000 of them stop off here twice a year. Throughout their long journey, the cranes fly in the company of thousands of smaller birds. A wood pigeon, one which evaded the Pyrenean hunters, and some bramblings feed at the crane's feet. The crane's slender toes resemble the symbol for the family tree, hence the word pedigree, a corruption of the French pied de grue, meaning crane's foot. As the cranes get closer to their nesting grounds, the 3-year-old birds come into breeding condition for the first time and start to look for mates. The family ties begin to weaken. For the first time for 10 months, last year's young are no longer the center of attention. Other migrants, such as crows, wait alongside for good weather conditions. Cranes are sensitive to changes in the weather. They seem to be able to predict when it will be fine. At the approach of a favorable weather system, they prepare to continue their journey north. By now, the young birds are becoming more and more independent, but away from the adults, they are still in danger. Confused and suddenly alone, the young are vulnerable. In thick fog, these inexperienced birds run the risk of flying headlong into electric cables. New power lines stretch across Europe in every direction and account for an increasing number of deaths every year. The power lines are yet another hazard to be avoided on the odyssey across Europe. So far, most of the birds seem to be adapting to the changing landscape. Leaving Lac de Der, the cranes fly on non-stop back to the North German island of Rügen, a journey of over 500 miles. There are no thermals over the Baltic Sea, so to save energy, the cranes wait for strong southerly winds. Then once again they cross the Swedish coast on the last leg of their long journey. Exactly 12 months after they last arrived, the cranes return to Hornborga. The migration has come full circle. Not all have survived, but those that have made it safely back celebrate with a show of pure exuberance. The few families which are still together now split up. The young crane has lost its high whistling call, and the adults no longer respond to its demands. In its second year, the bird will start to court a mate, but it will probably not breed until it's 3 or even 4 years old. Many of the areas used by the cranes on their great migration are likely to be lost in the next few years. Without such havens, the outlook for these magnificent birds is bleak indeed. Their difficulties are not unique. All migratory birds are suffering as the last wetlands are drained, as forests are felled, and as hunters continue to take their toll. Early Europeans believed the cranes were messengers, flying from the land beyond the north wind. Today, they bring a more urgent message, alerting us to the plight of our vanishing wetlands and wild places.